death penalty since inception, really. And every year we realize that all countries celebrate their own milestones around human rights. But why not come together on a question of the death penalty? So this was constituted 20 years ago, actually. 20 years ago, because you're on the 21st day. And ICJ and the Kenya Human Rights Commission in Kenya are a member of the World Coalition. So that is how it came to be. We believe that the death penalty is a violation of human rights because of, first of all, how it is meted out, the manner in which people are executed. It is wrong. It is cruel, inhumane, and degrading treatment because in some countries it's done through gas, other countries lethal injection. Our country, if it was to be done, it would be done by hanging until death, which is actually very cruel if you think about the process itself. Okay. So it's cruel, inhumane treatment. Not only does it do that in terms of the execution, but let's look at it from the point of determination that you are guilty and you're sentenced to death. If you did not get the right fair trial processes accorded to you, you will feel that the whole process has been unjust. Okay. So either you are tortured for a confession, you did not get adequate legal representation, you are not conversant with the language of the court, because our courts speak in mostly English or Swahili. Okay. So if you're not really conversant with the processes, everything becomes unjust. So at point of sentence. Then we go into the point of you are now incarcerated. Depending on the time frame that you take, if you're 20 years on death row, it is such a different scenario for you. You're isolated, you don't get access to a lot of family members because maybe they abandoned you. Some family members are not very okay with a family member being on death row. So you get abandoned, you get isolated by your own family. But within the prison system, you're isolated from other inmates because death row inmates don't interact with others for security reasons, but also that is how it has been since colonialism.
For whose security?
Inmate security.
Of the other inmates?
The other inmates.
The other inmates.
Okay.
Death row inmates are considered
very dangerous.
Very dangerous, yet some of them are actually pretty harmless.
Dangerous.
No, we have interacted. Some of them are really good.
Okay.
So yeah, that's the idea. So there are very many levels of the torture element that we have really looked at ICJ. And we do believe it's actually torture.
Okay.
And of course, the last thing, the deprivation of life. I mean, life is sacred.
Okay.
And by virtue of you implementing the death penalty, it means you deprive of life.
All right.
I think there have been some successful rehabilitation programs. The prison project that was done in Kamiti Prison, whereby death row inmates or persons whose life sentences whose death sentences have been commuted to life, were actually given the opportunity to study. And some of them have gotten degrees in law from the University of London and have left the prison system after their sentences were commuted and have come and are now lawyers within the society.
So you have murderers who are lawyers?
We have persons who were previously on death row who have now been released, who are now lawyers. It is a bit difficult, of course, for them to practice, but they do have the opportunity to be members and contributors to the society. So some rehabilitation has worked.
I take it that they studied criminal law.
They studied law. Potentially with an emphasis on criminal law because of what we had gone through.
Because their own personal experience.
Because of their own personal experience. And actually it really helps a lot because when
But the conviction was not lifted.
The conviction was...
It's the sentence that was commuted.
The sentence was commuted. And some of them had really sustained their perception of innocence until the last day when their sentences were commuted. So you really never know whether the person was innocent or guilty. There are some who have left and reopened their cases just so that they can get an innocent verdict. Because ideally, once your sentence is commuted, unfortunately, you are still guilty at the point.
Sure.
We do normally get the victims' perspectives in these matters. The Victim Protection Act actually allows for a victim's voice to be heard within the criminal justice process. So we do get the perspective of the victim and the family, particularly, of the person. And in this entire debate of the death penalty, we are not negating the impact that it has on the victims' families. I think I want to come up front and say that. But what we are saying is even the victims sometimes, they say that for us, whether or not you kill the person who killed our person, it will not bring us back our person. So their perception of justice is not the execution of the person. It's for this person to appreciate what they did, how it impacted our society, to reform, rehabilitate, and become a champion against what they did.
Okay.
Because that is how they perceive justice. The other thing around victims is sometimes even the implementation of the death penalty contravenes their beliefs, both personal beliefs and religious beliefs. Because there are some people who are actually of the conviction that you cannot kill another person. So by implementing the death penalty, you are further violating their personal belief, because now they have violated their religious beliefs because of what they will subject that person to.
Right.
So it's a mixed perspective from the victims, and I don't think all of them ascribe to the eye for an eye mentality.
Yes.
However, it's important that we do not also pardon people. I mean, if you have committed a murder, it is a very serious offense, and that is why we are looking at
rape. If you've
So
committed
there should be
robbery
some
with
punishment
violence.
of sort. And Mheshimiwa, you're saying, so what you're proposing is, let's actually have life imprisonment instead of the death penalty.
Yes.
Studies have shown that a lot of persons who end up in the criminal justice system generally are poor and vulnerable, be it for serious offenses, but also for petty offenses. But since today's on the serious offenses, I'll go in that general direction. So on the serious offenses, the questions begin from the fact that at point of arrest, many do not understand the crime that they committed. One would imagine that potentially depriving someone of their property in a forceful nature in the company of another person would just be threatening. But it's actually robbery with violence, because that is one of the elements, to be in the presence of two. Not necessarily even wielding a weapon, but in the presence of two. So now you are arrested at that point. You actually agree, because indeed what the police say is what you'll agree to. You go through the criminal justice process. The prosecution prepares their prosecution, a well-tight case. You do not have the resources to get an advocate. Remember that the National Legal Aid Service, which is the body mandated to provide you with legal aid or a legal defense, doesn't have the capacity for the whole country. So they mostly prioritize murder cases and a few other very serious robbery with violence cases and sexual offenses cases. So you do not have an advocate at that point. You go through the process without having the opportunity to adequately defend yourself, and you then get charged with robbery with violence and the death penalty. So I think what we are saying is, and I really want to rehash this, we are not really negating the voice of the victim here. We are not saying that what they did was wrong. I mean, what they did was right. We are saying that every person deserves an opportunity to be heard. Every person deserves fair representation before criminal justice systems. We do not have a perfect system within our criminal justice. And also, when we go into the lives of persons who are incarcerated in prison, we need to have a graduated approach. Because one thing about the death penalty is we actually believe that the people who ought to suffer the death penalty are of the serious of the most serious. And sometimes you find that the people who are there are not really the most serious offenders who deserve the death penalty. But on the merits of it all, from a human rights point of view, no one should deserve the death penalty because of its cruel, inhumane nature. But looking at the point where we are at as Kenya, Kenya has yet to really sign on to a few other protocols that would dictate whether we abolish the death penalty. The second optional protocol, which actually talks about abolition of the death penalty to the ICCPR. We haven't done that. And when we look at the fact that people every single day get sentenced to death, we always leave that as an opportunity for manipulation. Should one day someone wakes up and decides to actually hang everyone, there are people who have gone through their appeal process and their guilty verdicts have been vacated. So we cannot disregard the fact that there are certain innocent people who are actually going on with their lives within the criminal justice system. There are also certain things that are not system issues. When you look at the question of the mandatory death penalty and the nature of the mandatory nature of it all. So the Francis Moruatetu case actually declared mandatory death penalty unconstitutional. The reason for that is because it violated the right to fair trial, which is by virtue of you being charged with murder, the end game...
There can only be one outcome.
There's only one outcome, irrespective of your mitigation. And people had really good mitigation. I know there's a case, let me not cite it. I know there's a case where a person had been beaten brutally by her partner for over 10 years. And one day, she retaliated, but unfortunately the retaliation was very swift.
Was fatal.
And final.
Conclusive.
It was a conclusive retaliation, and the person died. She was charged with murder. The mitigation was not considered, and she actually went on death row.
Yes.
But upon appeal, they actually vacated that, and she was released because had they considered the mitigation, this is someone who wouldn't have been in jail. And that is the case for a lot of women. A lot of women actually end up in the system because of intimate partner violence. A lot of people actually end up in the system because of mental issues. And I think as Kenya, we are now waking up to the question around mental illnesses that have actually plagued everyone, including persons in the criminal justice system. So I think there's a lot to unpack in terms of people and their illnesses that have led to them committing certain crimes. But I think the day for us is very symbolic because it allows us to reflect on people who never get the opportunity to be heard. We have now abolished the mandatory death penalty within the question of murder, but it doesn't apply to the question of robbery with violence. It doesn't apply to the question of the others, aiding and abetting, taking an oath to commit a capital offense. The reason being the Supreme Court in 2021 was very clear that this judgment is very strict on the question of murder. Should you want to have the mandatory minimums lifted on the others, then institute a similar case all the way up. And if you look at the question of the Moruatetu case, it took a very long time before we got that judgment. And at the end of the day, the onus to repeal the laws rests with Parliament. So that is why we are looking to Parliament to repeal the laws, because ideally, no matter how you go about it, the judiciary will always have its hands tied because they can only declare it unconstitutional and refer it back to the National House. But for us, we are thinking, if you have a parole system, because actually even the parole system was recommended in the task force that was created after the Moruatetu 1 judgment in 2017. The Attorney General led a task force, and one of the recommendations was to institute a parole board whereby different actors would sit together, look at a particular convict, look at how they have performed within the prison system, look at how they have reformed, get the victims' impact statements from the families, and then with that information assess whether this person could be released. That was something that should have been created. It has been in the books for quite a while. It's not a new thing, but it hasn't worked. So those are the things that are being championed, and I know with the Prison Act that is about to be repealed and the repeal is coming to the House, that is one of the things that they have put in. But moving back, systems have tried to be changed. We have pushed for the National Legal Aid Service to get its legal aid fund. We have also pushed for that in Parliament. If they got well-resourced, hopefully they can actually do the job of a public defender because they have that mandate. So I don't think we need a new office. We need to strengthen the National Legal Aid Service because that's one of their core mandates. If you look at the question of mandatory minimums, it's a statute issue. You'd have to repeal the various laws that bind the hands of the judicial officers. If you also look at the question of knowledge, in terms of people understanding what are laws, what actually offenses carry the death penalty or not. That is a question of awareness creation. We rarely do awareness creation on the question of crimes because we assume that you shouldn't do crimes, but people just need to take the initiative to understand what could potentially happen should you commit a particular crime. The Court of Appeal has given a decision to the effect that life imprisonment, by the way it is coined in our statute, is actually unconstitutional. Because life ideally should be determinate. Is it natural life? Because if it's natural life, then that is a death penalty. Because ideally you will never leave. You will die within the prison. But you should have a life sentence of 30, 40, 50 years. You should know what you're targeting for in order for you to say that this is the point where I can apply for parole. This is the point where someone can even assess whether you have reformed. So even the whole question around life sentences, one thing that we often forget is when we actually sentence people to death or life sentence, these people enter a system that will become their system for the rest of their lives. So we need to make it a humane place altogether. And for a lot of people who have visited prisons, you can tell that it's not humane. It's not fit for purpose. We haven't really rehabilitated our prisons since the colonial days. I've not heard any single member of parliament talk about we're building a new prison, because it's not a CDF issue. The ministry, the CS will
When was the last time a new prison was
My sister,
built in
we have
Kenya?
not built schools.
I don't know. No, but in fairness,
we are building schools.
we are building schools. We are building hospitals. We are building schools and hospitals, but we have not had anyone talk about you are building a prison. And that is why when you talk about persons with mental disability who are in the criminal justice system and they need to be housed somewhere, when you talk about Matheka has a bed capacity of I think 200 or 300 in the maximum side.
And it's a
already
hospital,
full.
not a jail.
It has both facilities.
Okay.
So it's already full. You don't have a new facility. So indeed, the system isn't fit for purpose today. So a lot of people ought not to be there. So there are whole conversations around decongestion of prisons because of petty offenders. But when you look at the most serious of the serious offenders, are they living in conditions that are humane? No, they are not. The system has changed significantly. I think right now.
Really?
Yes, it has, because of case management at the judiciary and also some systems that have been put in place, including the Uadilifu system by the DPP. People are able to complain, people are able to report, people are able to say whether they've been forgotten within the system. So we have lesser numbers. I'm not saying everything is perfect, but we have lesser numbers of forgotten persons within remand. The unfortunate persons who are actually forgotten within remand are persons who have mental disability, because they themselves cannot move themselves to actually report. So they're a vulnerable group. For us as ICJ, we look at the question of death penalty as it has violated numerous rights. We look at it from the question of deprivation of life is wrong. Cruel, inhumane treatment by virtue of how it's executed is really wrong, because the cruelty of the execution itself, if you look at various reports around the way that the way that the prison system actually responds when an execution is taking place, you will know it not only traumatizes the person who is about to be executed, but all the inmates, because you feel it and you hear it and you know you're next. So it actually traumatizes the various inmates who are inside.
True.
Yes.
But Julie,
the criminal justice system is quite complex. I don't think we can have a silver bullet for anything. So I think, first of all, abolishing the death penalty will be one step. Qualifying what is life will be another step. Instituting the parole board to look at the people who are in there, and they're not actually just limited to people on life. Parole is actually supposed to be an exhaustive process for anyone who has a long sentence. We'll ensure that people can actually have opportunities to leave the system if they have reformed. When you look at other countries that have actually abolished the death penalty, they actually create systems to ensure that people who are serving long sentences get the opportunity to leave, but people who are not reformed get an opportunity to stay and actually get reformed. So it works both ways. It's not that everyone will be leaving, but it will be a very just and humane way to process people's entry into society. When you look at the other systems that need to be funded, we have talked about the underfunding of the criminal justice system. It's very important to talk about it. We need to fund the criminal justice system. We need to have more advocates, more judges, more magistrates, prosecutors, more trained prison officers. It's a whole ecosystem. So you can't say there's one silver bullet to fixing it, but we will move an inch further if we do abolish the death penalty.
Stage is your bill, Opiyo?
Well, the bill has gone through the first reading. Is presently before the Justice and Legal Affairs Committee, the JLAC, for processing readiness for the second reading. In other words, it's being subjected to public participation shortly. Yes, and then the committee will do a report to accompany the bill at the second reading stage, where the MPs are going to debate it robustly before they take a vote.
Say it's voted on,
Yes.
and MPs say yes to this bill. What should we see within a year?
I'm praying really that that is voted for and it is finally assented to, for it to become law. It will bring out a lot of change in the way our system works.